Hello, okay, in this video we're going to have a look at potential exam questions on the issue of collective and individual ministerial responsibility. And perhaps not being very, I can't think of a great deal that can really ask you apart from do these conventions still hold or not, or are they still important or not, something along those sorts of lines. So that'll be the focus of this particular video. Now, just note, if the question is about collective and individual ministerial responsibility, you must make sure that you mention both of them in the essay. Either do one paragraph on one and one paragraph on the other. I'm going to give you a couple of arguments for and against it being important or not for both of the conventions. Then obviously in an essay you can then mix and match which ways you do it. Also, it's up to you whether you want to argue that they are important or they are not important. The important thing though is to say why you think they are important or why you think they are not important, and obviously say why your argument is more important than the alternative arguments. So what we'll do, we'll look first of all at collective ministerial responsibility. So I'll go through an argument to say that they are important. So this convention, you could argue, is important because it's a key element of unity for governments and creates that clear accountability which governments have. And there's been a number of occasions where ministers have either resigned because they cannot continue collective responsibility, or they've been sacked for deliberately going against government policy on a certain issue. Normally they tend to resign as opposed to get sacked, but anyway, so for some examples of this, Lord Agnew resigned in January this year, 2022, because he could no longer agree with the government's policy of dealing with fraud over COVID. You had Lord what's his name, who resigned last week, who's now forgotten here, Lord Wolfson, Wolfson, who argued, well, he resigned because he believed that Boris had broken the rule of law and he could no longer be in a government led by Boris Johnson. Other examples, which I mentioned on the other video, like Robin Cook and Claire Short resigned in 2003 against the Blair government because they could not agree over the war with Iraq. So there's some examples of ministers, and you've got some Blair examples there and some Johnson examples there of ministers who resigned because they could not agree with collective responsibility. And therefore it's an important convention because these important ministers have resigned because they couldn't agree to it, and the convention is important because government unity, clear accountability, having all ministers agreeing with government decisions is clearly an important principle of government. However, a weakness of this view, if you want to do the other side, is that it's no longer important because it's come under great strain. There are lots of examples of ministers who have not resigned, even though they have publicly disagreed with the government's collective view in public. For example, there are quite a lot of examples under Theresa May of this taking place. You've got quite a few of the ones to do with Brexit. For example, a number of ministers disagreed over the Chequers Agreement, which Theresa May had, but they didn't resign over the issue. Another example, which is not to do with Brexit so much, under Theresa May, is the Chancellor Philip Hammond publicly disagreed with David Davis, who was the Brexit Secretary, over the free movement of people. So again, that was a public disagreement between two ministers, and therefore they'd broken collective responsibility, yet they didn't resign. I think an important reason behind that was because Theresa May could not actually get rid of these two ministers because obviously her administration was not particularly strong. To lose the Chancellor and the Brexit Secretary again would have undermined her administration. So this shows that politically it's not important because ministers don't always resign, and if they do disagree with the government on collective responsibility, and again it's often because these ministers felt that they were kind of immune from resignation because the government was quite weak. A second argument to say that collective responsibility is actually important is the fact that it is actually quite flexible, and it's part of the prime ministerial power as to when they wish to apply it. And there have been occasions where prime ministers have decided to suspend collective responsibility over an issue which they know their ministers disagree with. They tend to occur over referendums. So, for example, in 1975, Harold Wilson suspended collective responsibility over should the UK remain in part of the what was then called the European Economic Community, and in a very similar way, David Cameron suspended collective responsibility over the EU referendum in 2016. On both occasions, you saw government ministers disagreeing with each other in public, but they were allowed to because the Prime Minister had suspended collective responsibility, which in some ways shows it's an important convention because it's the Prime Minister was using their powers to suspend this important convention. I suppose another example actually was over the AV referendum with the coalition, where Liberal Democrats and Conservative ministers again publicly disagreed over that particular issue. However, a weakness of this view, which is the other side of the argument, is the fact that this has only occurred at particular times where a Prime Minister has decided to suspend collective responsibility, and therefore it shows it's not important because it's at the whim of the Prime Minister. And actually, on those occasions where it has been suspended, I would argue it's actually led to quite divided governments as a consequence. Obviously, they had the whole Brexit situation, which Theresa May had to pick up, and even in 1975, after that public disagreement between ministers, again it became quite difficult for Prime Ministers to assert authority afterwards. And therefore you might say it's not an important principle, because the fact the Prime Minister can just suspend it as and when, because they know they can't get agreement between their ministers, shows a weak Prime Minister, and it shows that this convention is basically at the whim of the Prime Minister. Okay, on to individual ministerial responsibility. Again, I've got two arguments to say it's important and two to say that it is not. So we'll do important first of all. You could argue it's an important responsibility because it holds ministers to account to Parliament. If they know that when they're being questioned at departmental select committees or on the floor of the House of Commons, they know they've got to understand what's happening in their government departments, and they've got to take responsibility for what's happening in their government departments. Otherwise, they know they might have to resign for either misleading MPs inadvertently or appearing like they're kind of out of control and don't understand what's happening. And therefore it's an important convention for ensuring that ministers are held to account, and also ensuring that they fully appreciate and understand the decisions which are being made in their department. For example, Amber Rudd in 2018 resigned as Home Secretary because she spoke to the Departmental Select Committee on Home Affairs, and she kind of denied that there wasn't targets set for deporting people with the Windrush scandal. It later transpired that there was, and so therefore she felt she misled Parliament, and therefore she resigned shortly afterwards. However, a witness of this view is that often ministers will try to shift the blame and try to say it wasn't their fault, this decision which went wrong was down to other people, how can they control every single decision which is being made in their department, and therefore they kind of avoid having to resign. A really good example of this was in 2020, Gavin Williamson, over the exam fiasco. He tried to put the blame onto Ofqual, which is the exam regulating board, saying it's their fault that the exams went wrong and all the algorithms and all the rest of it. And he survived. He wasn't sacked over that particular issue. Another example of a COVID was Matt Hancock. In 2020, he again tried to blame Public Health England for some of the problems with the COVID response and the high death rate, etc., etc. So again, he was shifting the blame onto a government agency, and therefore he avoided having to take responsibility for those particular failings. And therefore this shows it's not an important convention anymore, because ministers are able to shift the balance of power, and again it's the Prime Minister who has the ultimate decision whether to remove that minister or not, and in both these occasions Boris Johnson chose not to. Regarding individual responsibility and kind of personal indiscretions, you could say it is an important convention, because there have been a number of ministers who have been forced to resign because of personal indiscretions, and therefore it's an important convention because ministers know they've got to kind of keep on the straight and narrow. So Matt Hancock, for example, in 2021 had to resign for having the affair, and also that affair broke COVID regulations at the time, and so therefore after a couple of days of this scandal, he fell on his sword, basically, or was sacked. It's a bit debatable which way around it was. In 2017, Damien Green, he was found to have basically pornography was found on his office computer. He denied it, and again the scandal built, and he had to resign from office. So therefore, it's an important convention because it ensures that ministers have to keep. I suppose probity, isn't it? Okay, and they've also got to be aware of this in their role. However, a witness of this view is that actually many ministers seem to survive these indiscretions, and again it's up to the Prime Minister as and when to remove them unless they decide to go themselves. So Boris Johnson, for example, refused to sack Priti Patel when she was found to have broken the ministerial code for bullying accusations in the civil service, and as far as I'm aware she still is the Home Secretary, so she avoided having to go for breaking the ministerial code. And so therefore it shows it's not an important convention because ministers do survive these situations, and again it's up to the Prime Minister as to when they go. Very often what you'll find is it's often down to media pressure as well as anything else. So if the media are running negative stories about a minister for some kind of incompetence or some kind of personal indiscretion, Prime Ministers often are quite reluctant to see a minister go. However, if those news stories go on for a day or two, and it's sucking up all government kind of activities, I suppose, and this kind of firefighting around the issue is trying to save that minister,